Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Very glad to be joined, at least virtually online today, by longtime friend and associate Lauren McGaughy of the Dallas Morning News. Lauren is an investigative reporter focused on gender, sexuality, and politics at the Dallas Morning News. Has been a guest before. We were trying to sort out how long it's been. We think about 5 years. Though, you know, given the last few dog years, it took us a while to figure that out. So welcome, Lauren. Thanks for being here.
Thanks. I'm really happy to be talking about this issue.
So let's get right to it then. Your beat has been a very active one, and I want to start with the most recent issue before we kind of go back and look at context and how some of these issues have evolved. So I want to start by asking you to bring us up to speed on recent events in the realm of gender affirmative care for transgender kids in Texas. The most recent chain of events seems to me was triggered by linked announcements by Attorney General Paxton and Governor Abbott. Not coincidentally, I don't think, although we'll get into that, in the final weeks of the Republican primary. So can you give us some background on that and kind of bring us up to the present?
Sure. I'll try to make this as user-friendly because it can get in the weeds very quickly. In February, we saw this opinion come out from General Paxton. It's a non-binding opinion. It's basically Paxton saying, hey, I'm going to take a look at current law that's already on the books and give you my thoughts. And he issued a new interpretation of the state's child abuse law, where he said explicitly that his belief is that certain kinds of gender-affirming medical treatments for trans minors are child abuse under the current statute. So he issues that, and very soon after, the governor sends a letter to the Department of Family and Protective Services saying, hey, you have to investigate any reports of this, quote, alleged abuse. And he also CC'd a bunch of other state agencies on it that deal with kids, like the Education Department, the Juvenile Justice Department. And interestingly, the governor also explicitly warned in that letter that teachers and certain other state workers are required to report abuse. And if they don't, there's criminal penalties. And there are even reporting requirements for the public. So they were very strong statements from two of the most highly elected men highest elected officials in the state. And within days, we actually saw a lawsuit from a state worker who works for that same agency, the Department of Family and Protective Services, who is suing to block this directive from the governor and the attorney general because this state worker has a transgender daughter who's a teenager getting gender affirming care. And the state worker says they were put on leave and investigated for alleged abuse after this directive came out. So where we are right now is tomorrow there's supposed to be a court hearing in Travis County about this request from the state worker to block the directive for just her family. The judge has said she will consider whether then to block this directive, block these investigations statewide for everybody. But it is one of the hottest political issues right now, and it's one that is really having a trickle-down effect for a lot of groups: teachers, CPS caseworkers, doctors, really anyone whose lives touch the lives around children, and specifically trans children.
So for our listeners, we're recording this on Thursday, so that hearing is Friday.
Yes.
And I also want to, how familiar are you with the legal arguments that the person who's brought this suit, the family that's brought this suit, I mean, what is the argument they're making to try to enjoin this investigation? Do you know? I think you said you had looked at the court documents.
Yeah, so it's the parent, the state worker who's been put on leave, who has a trans daughter, and then there's also a physician, a mental health care provider out of Houston, and they're giving separate arguments. So the parent says, "Look, the best practices, medical suggestions are that certain kinds of care is appropriate for trans kids. I've talked with my doctor about it. I've talked with my kid about it. I'm not doing anything that's outside of the regular scope of how you approach treating a transgender minor. And by investigating me for child abuse, not only has it affected my job, but my relationship with my child." So that's the state worker's argument. The physician is saying that she has certain medical requirements, ethical requirements to provide care. A doctor can actually be found to be in breach of certain ethical requirements if they deny care or refuse care. And she says by not allowing her to treat trans children according to the best medical practices currently on the books, by investigating her, by requiring her to turn over patients and their parents, that it would actually breach those ethics. So different arguments on two sides.
That's great. That's super helpful, I think. Since we're talking about this care and you've raised the arguments of the doctor, I'm interested. I know you've done some work on this. Can you tell us what the nature of gender affirmative care is? I mean, and I ask, in part just to fill in the facts, but also because, as you're well aware, and I think you're probably seeing in your Twitter feed, a lot of the most hyperbolic support for these kinds of actions that the governor and the attorney general have taken the form of very extreme portrayals of what gender affirmative care looks like, particularly I think appealing to, bodily anxiety and, this, very loose references and intimations of very, fundamental kind of physical surgical procedures, which my understanding is that is not the case. And so I'd be interested if you could fill us in a little bit more on what you know about what the protocols are and what the nature of this gender affirmative care is.
Yeah, thanks for giving me the opportunity to do that. If listeners want to read some of this too, we wrote a story back in November, the Dallas Morning News. The headline is "Dallas Clinic Genesis Cuts Care to Transgender Kids," and it's actually a primer also on what gender affirming care is. So, in a very basic way, there's multiple tiers of treatment, just like there is for anything you're trying to treat anything, right? And there's a lot of misinformation out there about what's actually happening and what is recommended for someone who's under the age of 18 that is trans. The actual thing that is being treated is called gender dysphoria. It's a feeling of discomfort or even like physical distress in someone who identifies as a gender different from that assigned at birth. Not all trans people experience that. So some trans people will go their whole lives never taking a hormone, never thinking about surgical interventions, nothing. But gender dysphoria is the actual symptom that you're treating if someone is actually considering treatment. For kids that are prepubescent, the only real suggestion by every major medical group, all of them, including the ones that deal solely with trans people, is it's all about mental health care, and at most it's social transition, which might be something like a kid trying out a new name, maybe dressing a little differently, maybe using a different pronoun, but no real interventions with any medical treatment that you might think of, like taking a pill or getting a shot or something like that. It's after the kid has begun to experience puberty, that oftentimes those discussions begin. Because, as we all know, puberty is when your body starts changing. And that's oftentimes when the feelings of gender dysphoria in a youth are the most noticeable, right? They come to the surface in a literal way. So it's only really after mental health guidance and discussions with mental health providers that a parent and a child and a doctor would consider doing something like puberty blockers. So let me just take a step back. You're probably hearing about puberty blockers, hormone therapy, and then surgical interventions. They're all very different things, and they all are appropriate for different age levels and sometimes not appropriate for different age levels. So for kids experience puberty, younger kids, they may try puberty blockers with the advice of a doctor and their parent and with their consent, which is it's basically halting the progression of puberty. So it puts a brick wall there. And the idea there is that it allows the minor to continue therapy, continue those discussions, continue working through those feelings of gender dysphoria without having to deal with the continuing changing in their body that they experience during puberty. If afterwards a minor with the agreement again of the doctor and the parent believe that there needs to be another intervention, there can be hormone therapy added to as another step or as a parallel step, and that is actually taking something like testosterone or a female hormone or a male hormone to see changes in the body. This is really only suggested for people that are again already experiencing puberty, have been undergoing therapy for an extensive period of time, and have tried other things before this happens. It is absolutely not recommended by any major medical group that someone under the age of 18 or under the age of consent, rather, get surgery to treat gender dysphoria. In Texas, the age of consent is 18. And so it is exceedingly, exceedingly rare that someone under the age of 18 would be getting any kind of surgical intervention to treat being gender dysphoria, a trans person. It's just
right, and
so rare, it's almost not happening.
Yeah, and to be clear, if it has happened, it seems like there's at least a shot there was either some kind of a medical, contingency related to that, or it was done, separate from medical advice, right? Which I would think would make is one of the things that makes it so rare.
Right, and like some of these things, like puberty blockers, are used already in kids who are not transgender, who are experiencing early puberty. You might have a really little kid who's all of a sudden undergoing puberty at they're 8 or 9, and so this is already being prescribed to kids for other medical issues separate from, treating gender dysphoria.
And in those circumstances, my understanding is that when you have a non-surgical, when you have just broadly speaking, a hormonal or pharmaceutical intervention, that's utterly reversible, right? In other words, you can...
Nearly all of them are, yes. Puberty blockers are reversible. So if you see information out there that says puberty blockers are not reversible, that according to all of the current studies, that is not true. When we're talking about hormone therapy, there are certain, effects of certain hormone therapies that will permanently change the characteristics of someone. For example, testosterone, sometimes people's voices get lower when they take it for an extended period of time. That sometimes is not reversible.
Okay.
And then for trans girls who might be taking female hormones, it depends on the age. It depends on, the fact that they've passed puberty and how long they've been taking it. But there are studies now looking into fertility, short-term and long-term fertility consequences for extended use of feminine hormones in minors. So these are all issues that would be discussed with the doctor, mental health care provider, the parent, and the child. because, again, they're serious medical decisions that all of those individuals should be involved in making the decision behind.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that research, and putting you on the spot a little bit since you're not a doctor, but that was a really great, careful explanation, and I really appreciate it. I want to sort of step back into, but then also back a little bit to mangle the metaphor. You've reported on the high visibility politics in this area for a while. Even before you were formally on this beat, it kind of intersected your other beat in a lot of ways in terms of being a state political reporter. I'm wondering how you see, the longer arc of this issue as we go back to, probably the first major emergence of this issue, of related issues in 2017 with the so-called bathroom bill, which, of course, did not pass, was blocked in the House in 2017. Amid pretty high visibility politics. I mean, how do you see that developing? And, in simplest terms, I mean, did you expect it to come back after 2017? I mean, I know you were covering that issue. Did you kind of think, okay, we've this issue has been met and controversial, but sort of didn't pass. Were you surprised when it came back or not?
I wasn't. To take it even a step further back from the bathroom bills, in 2015 was when the U.S. Supreme Court declared gay marriage legal for everybody statewide or nationwide, and Texas was one of those states that had not legalized it. And it was after that case that at least the political watchers in the room said that conservative legal scholars said, okay, well, that fight is out the window, and they turned their sights to transgender rights. The first iteration was the bathroom bill issue, like you said, 2017. That didn't pass mostly because of opposition from big business. But the very next year, we saw more LGBT issues. We saw the emergence of the transgender athletes in public schools issue, which, as we now know, passed last session. Took a little bit longer, but it did pass. And now we're seeing this focus on healthcare access for trans minors. I think there's always going to be a what's next for individuals who are not happy with the fact that certain groups like LGBTQ people are getting more rights. And, the transgender rights before 2015 were not really at the forefront because there were still these other battles being fought. So I'm not surprised that it's still such a hot debate because, trans folks don't have the same rights as as lesbian, gay, and bisexual people have, federally or in the state. And this isn't going to be put to bed until that happens, and probably not after that either. So I'm really not surprised, but it all really kind of dates back to that 2015 court case when it felt like the gay marriage debate was mostly settled, and people were thinking, well, what's next?
Well, and interestingly enough, settled not only in terms of the legal ruling of the Supreme Court, but, and I'd leave it to Supreme Court scholars to parse this more carefully. But, we saw rapid movement in at least relatively speaking, in public opinion in the polling we do on gay marriage, that also, was moving in the direction the court moved at the same, who was doing what and, how much tandem or who was out front there, I think one can parse in different ways. Your account of that raises a couple of things I wanted to talk about. I mean, you talked about business groups, but you also talked about, you made a kind of general reference to, people that were watching, people that were engaged said, well, we've lost that. We now have to, let's move on to this issue on this front. Where is that energy coming from to keep this more, this restrictive view of transgender rights on the table? Are there particular actors, and even more interesting to me, are there particular groups? In other words, who continues to push this? I mean, one of the things that was interesting in terms of the bathroom bill is that, even setting the business engagement aside, when we polled on that, we asked not only what is your position on this, but on this issue and on these proposals in the legislature, but how important do you think it is for the legislature to engage that? And I think that's one of the things that was one of the more interesting results, because it underlined that even among Republicans, there wasn't Republican voters, there wasn't a huge amount of interest in pushing this issue forward. So, I think the question has to be, where is this energy coming from, within, who are the folks that are pushing this, and how are they doing it?
Well, to give a nod to Patrick Svitek at the Tribune, had a recent story that really looked at the politics of this issue and, leaned on the fact that this did used to be more of a fringe issue in the Republican Party. And it's become more of a litmus test issue just within, a couple of years. I think that there are multiple groups, national groups and state groups that are, keeping this debate alive. In fact, there's a group that Paxton actually cited in his opinion about access to care for trans minors, called the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, that he cited as a source for his opinions, that has really been out there as a quote unquote health professional group questioning this kind of care for transgender children and adolescents. And, we saw it most notably on the political side in the primary campaigns of some of the more, far right conservative candidates in Texas, Don Huffines, a bit from Allen West, and Paxton, reacting to the fact that he had multiple challengers kind of trying to take a stand on this issue. So I think it's an amalgam of things. But that's a great question. I mean, that's something I'm going to put on my my question bank. Like, what are the most groups on this, and who's keeping it alive? But as Svitek wrote in his story, it doesn't look like it's going to go anywhere anytime soon. It feels very alive, very, we're going to be talking about this for several months, if not longer.
Right. By going anywhere, it's not going away. It's almost certainly headed towards the legislative agenda in 2023, based on where we are now. So, you talked about the role of business groups, and this kind of was also, I read this, Patrick's excellent story that you referenced. He portrays the business groups as more tentative, I think, now than they were in the past. Does that make sense to you based on your reporting and what you've seen?
Yeah, maybe not tentative, but definitely less outspoken. There were coalitions coming together against the bathroom bill in 2017. They were taking out ads in newspapers, IBM and Apple and Facebook. And while they have come out against, more conservative legislation like the voting rights bill and some of this other legislation in recent years, it feels like it's been less loud, I have to admit. And as Patrick writes, the Republicans aren't really going for it anymore. They're not really heeding the concerns of big business like they did 5 years ago. So I can't get into the mind of those executives, but I almost wonder if they're saying, well, does it even matter what we say anymore if they're not going to listen to American Airlines and, these other huge companies? Does it matter for us to risk our political capital with these guys on an issue that they've already made up their minds on? Yeah,
I mean, I think, Patrick raises this, and this has been kind of widely discussed after 2021, in which there's a situation which I think, business groups get engaged in this. It's often somewhat reluctant, I think, particularly business groups that have a lot of business before the legislature. And there's an institutional factor here, or an institutional political factor here, is that, Lieutenant Governor obviously looms large on an issue that's very important to the Lieutenant Governor. Lieutenant Governor has effective control of the Senate as of right now. And so if you're a business group with a wide range of your usual regulatory and business concerns before the legislature, getting involved in what shareholders might, or certainly, I think lobby teams might see as non-core issues, becomes difficult to do. And the math of that is very hard, is very hard. And I think we have seen it shift.
For sure. Yeah. And I think next session, 2023, that's going to be the session where we see, okay, do they just sit it out? Or do they go even harder than they did against the bathroom bills and take a stand? And we'll have to see what they do. Yeah,
I think there's a lot of things in play here. I think some of those business groups in 2017 were quietly encouraged. Actually, they were directly encouraged by Speaker Joe Straus at the time, who, as I recall, gave a pretty, high profile, a couple of very high profile speeches saying, if you think that measures like this are bad for business in Texas, essentially, I need your help. We can't do it without you. And I don't think there's a presence in the Republican Party doing that right now. It sounds to me, I wanted to ask you how strong you thought the cross currents are in the Republican Party. Before we came on, we were talking about some new national polling that just came out, that I should say, that was released to the 19th. I haven't had a chance to look at it, and I don't think you've had a chance to look at the nuts and bolts very quickly. But I think, what we've seen in our polling across time, doing it, the UT stuff that we've done, and we haven't polled on these issues really since last fall. And as I think you fairly point out, things are moving very quickly. Early on, I felt like there were a lot of cross currents in public opinion, among, including, if not especially, among Republicans. As recently as October, about a third of Texans didn't really want to make any kind of approval judgment about banning trans kids or limiting trans kids' access to high school sports and public schools. Clearly, Republican public opinion was leaning in the more prohibitive direction. Democrats were leaning in a more, in a direction that opposed that kind of legislation. But you could almost sense you didn't have to sense it. You could see there were large numbers of people that didn't have an opinion or weren't ready to express one, hadn't made up their mind. But it does feel like the partisan positions are hardening now, and we are going to see that, I think, in the next session. Does that make sense?
Oh, for sure. I think once something becomes the subject of what feels like daily headlines, people are gonna develop more of a stance on it. And it's been in the daily headlines for the better part of 3 weeks now in Texas. So I do feel like we're seeing a lot of people make up their minds early on this issue. There's a ton of misinformation out there about, like we talked about, what gender affirming care actually is, who's getting it. I think what is really fascinating to me, which I would love to see some polling done on, so hint, hint.
I have a pen out.
Is Texas is a freedom-loving state. That's our thing, right? And so, what was interesting in the 19th poll, this national poll that got released to the 19th, is it seems like the way that the question was asked was, should the government be involved in decisions about gender-affirming care, or should that decision be left to families and their doctors? And I think that is the big that's a big contention that I would see is, parents, the parental rights angle of this versus the state's interest in defining what child abuse is. We've seen in studies about like what you were talking about previously about the acceptance of gay rights, of gay marriage, that people's views radically changed when they had someone who is gay in their life. That, a kid came out to them, a friend, a coworker. And for many people, the trans community is so small, they may not have ever met someone or not been aware that they met someone who is trans. So it's not real for a lot of people, but I'd be curious to see what people think of the concept of a caseworker coming into your house and saying, you don't get to make that decision for your child. We're having those discussions about vaccines and all this other stuff, but for trans healthcare, the government is really getting involved and putting their hands on the issue.
Well, I think we've seen this, that frame is a very interesting one right now in a lot of different contexts, as you say. I mean, in healthcare, kind of across the board, and I think it speaks to either a shift in the attitudes about the role of government and the kind of frames that you're talking about, where the locus of decision making could be and should be, and where, but also how that kind of abstract principle, how well people's embrace of those abstract principles holds up in different contexts with other strong attitudes. I mean, we see that in other areas, like talking about state and local authority, et cetera. People have the way you kind of set that up is, the freedom-loving Texans, those principles are often a lot more malleable if you put them in different kind of contexts. So it's an interesting way of framing the question.
Yeah. I mean, I guess there are a lot of contradictions. In any really in any cultural or political discussion, but
I mean, if Josh if Josh was on the podcast, he'd be talking right now about just yes, people, we spend a lot of time trying to smooth over the contradictions in people's in our own cognitive space, and we see that and we confront that a lot when we look at polling.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and that's why I brought up the issue of having an LGBT person that directly interacts with someone, because that is the only thing that is shown to change people's views, at least in in previous discussions about gay rights and same-sex marriage.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really astute observation, and it's something I think we've wondered about in this context, where just that the fact of that exposure and the size of the population that we're talking about has a huge impact, and it's kind of it's something of a structural factor that that activists have to accommodate. And I think, frankly, that I would be surprised if the activists pushing this legislation have not baked this into their strategy already. That they can count on people having limited experience and therefore not having a personal, more human impression of that shapes the position they take.
Sure.
And that they're counting on that.
Yeah.
Because the lack of personal information creates, I think, this space for or personal experience creates all this space for misinformation and disinformation, to be more direct about it, to seep in and shape their opinions, particularly if it's reinforced because it's coming from partisans.
Right. And, the largest populations of minors who identify as trans live in 3 states, California, Texas, New York, and Florida, right? Big states. So not surprising.
Yeah, which you would expect, right?
Right. But we're still talking about fewer than 1% of the population between the ages of 13 and 17. So it's an incredibly small number of people.
Yeah, and I think just, in harsh political terms, that's a problem. I mean, that's a political problem. Mm-hmm. That's not obviously not a judgment, but it is just the fundamentals of the situation that really, makes the arguments harder to make if people don't have access to experience to help, tap into, what one might think of as the better angels of their nature. Lauren, thanks for being here and helping with this. This has been, I think, it's helpful to me. I think it's informative to people hearing it. I hope we can do this again in person.
Yes.
as things get more normal. But certainly I'd like to have you back, sooner than 5 years or whatever we decided that was. Because I think you're right. This issue is going to move rapidly, and it will remain, I think, in a basket of issues that are salient, at least certainly to political actors in the state. And it'll be back in the session, so we hope to have you back.
I'd love to be back talking about it.
All right. Well, thanks to Lauren for her work and for being here. Thanks to our excellent studio production team and the audio studio in the Liberal Arts Development Studio here at UT Austin. Thanks for listening. Remember, you can find some of the data we've referenced today and some and lots more at the Texas Politics Project website at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. And we'll be back soon again with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.